She was invisible to him once, not metaphorically. Not in the way people say someone goes unnoticed at a party or gets overlooked in a crowd. No, she was invisible to him in the truest, most devastating sense of the word. She was the girl who ironed the creases out of his shirts, who polished the marble floors of his 30-room estate until she could see her own tired reflection staring back at her. She was the one who placed fresh lilies on the dining table every single morning, careful to space them exactly 3 inches apart because that was how he liked them. Not because he had ever told her, but because she had learned the way all invisible people learn, through watching, through silence, through surviving. She was the one he never looked at. And yet, on one ordinary Tuesday morning, 3 years before the night that would change everything, he looked at her, not in the way she had quietly hoped for during those long, lonely years of service. He looked at her the way a man looks at an inconvenience, like a smudge on an otherwise perfect window. His dark eyes swept over her kneeling figure. She had been collecting broken glass from a vase she had accidentally knocked from its pedestal. And when his gaze finally landed on her face, it was cold. It was disinterested. It was the look of a man who had already decided something before he even opened his mouth. "Pack your things," he said. Just that, 3 words. No explanation. No hesitation. She looked up at him, and for one reckless, trembling moment, she thought she saw something flicker in those stone-dark eyes. A pause. A ghost of something human, but it was gone before she could name it, swallowed whole by the rigid, immovable mask that Damiano Caruso wore for the entire world, including the woman kneeling before him who, unbeknownst to him, was carrying his child. She said nothing. She never said anything. That had always been her mistake, and perhaps her greatest act of dignity. She rose from the floor, glass still in her hands, and she looked at him one last time. He had already turned away. He was already reaching for his phone. She had already ceased to exist. Her name was Elena Vasquez, and the day Damiano Caruso dismissed her was the day she decided, quietly, without drama, without a single tear, that she would never be invisible again. To understand how Elena Vasquez ended up on her knees in the marble foyer of the most feared man in the city, you have to understand where she came from. She was born in a small apartment above a laundromat in the East Side district of the city, the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights flickered, and the dogs never seemed to stop barking, and everyone knew everyone else's pain because the walls between them were so thin. Her mother, Rosa Vasquez, was a woman of extraordinary warmth and absolute terrible luck. She worked herself into exhaustion her entire life, cleaning offices, folding laundry, scrubbing the homes of people who never once asked her name. She raised Elena alone, on tips and overtime, and the kind of stubborn love that refuses to be killed by circumstance. Elena grew up watching her mother disappear into the homes of wealthy strangers every morning, and she swore, the way only a young girl with fire in her chest can swear, that she would build a different life. She was brilliant in school, quietly, stubbornly brilliant. The kind of student who sits in the back row but answers every question correctly. She had applied to university on a scholarship, had dreams of studying architecture, of building things that lasted. She wanted to design spaces where people felt safe, where families could breathe. But then Rosa got sick. It came swiftly and without mercy, the diagnosis settling over their small apartment like a shadow that never lifted. Treatment was expensive. The scholarship wasn't enough. Elena withdrew from university in her second year, not with bitterness, but with the quiet, grinding determination of someone who simply does what needs to be done. She took the only job she was offered quickly, a housekeeping position at the Caruso estate on the northern edge of the city, where the gates were wrought iron and the gardens were immaculate, and the air itself seemed to carry a warning. She knew, of course, who Damiano Caruso was. Everyone in the city knew. He was 34 years old, heir to the Caruso crime dynasty, and had assumed full control of the family's vast network of power 3 years prior, after the death of his father, the legendary and terrifying Enzo Caruso. Damiano was not like the stories Elena had grown up hearing about his father, the wild rage, the theatrical cruelty. Damiano was different. He was cold where his father had been hot. He was surgical where his father had been savage. He moved through the world like a man who had already calculated every possible outcome and found all of them acceptable. He was 6'2" with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when it rained. He wore charcoal and black exclusively. He spoke rarely and never loudly, because the men around him had learned long ago that Damiano Caruso only had to say something once. He had never married, though half the city's most powerful families had offered him daughters. He had no close friends, only lieutenants. He had no softness that anyone had ever found, if it existed at all. He ran the Caruso empire, legitimate businesses layered over underground operations so deeply embedded in the city's infrastructure that removing him would have been like cutting out the city's own spine. Elena kept her head down in his household. She did her work with precision and care. She arrived at 5 in the morning. She left after 10 at night. She smiled at the other staff and said nothing about anything that mattered. She learned very quickly that the walls of the Caruso estate had ears, and that silence was the only currency worth anything in that house. But hearts are not designed for silence. She did not fall in love with Damiano Caruso in the way people fall in love in films, not with stolen glances across candlelit rooms or whispered confessions in the rain. It happened in fragments, in moments so small they almost didn't exist. The night she found him alone in his study at 2 in the morning, not working, not on his phone, just sitting in the dark with a glass of scotch, untouched in his hand, and an expression on his face that she had never seen before. Not cold, not calculating, but devastatingly, nakedly lost. She had placed a glass of water on his desk without a word and turned to leave, and he had said, quietly, into the dark, "My father died in that chair." She had stopped. She had not turned around, and he had not said another word, but she had stood still for 3 whole breaths before she walked away, and in those 3 breaths, something had changed. She started noticing the small things about him that no one else seemed to see. The way he paused outside the kitchen sometimes, not going in, just standing at the door as though he were listening to something only he could hear. The book of poetry she found once, opened to a page she didn't expect. Pablo Neruda, of all things. The way his jaw tightened when his lieutenants laughed too loudly about something that had cost a life. The way he always placed his watch on the left side of his nightstand, never the right. The scar that ran along the inside of his right hand, which he never explained, and which none of the staff ever dared to ask about. She built a portrait of him from these fragments, and she knew it was dangerous. She knew it was foolish. She was his employee. She was invisible. She was the girl who polished his floors. And then one evening in February, cold and blue outside the tall estate windows, everything shifted. She had been working late, restocking the linen closet on the upper floor, when a pipe in the ceiling above had burst without warning. Water had cascaded through the ceiling, soaking her completely, drenching the linens, and she had stumbled backward in shock into the hallway just as Damiano stepped out of his bedroom. He had stopped. She had been standing there, completely drenched, hair plastered to her face, holding a soaking towel against her chest, and for the first time in 2 years, he had looked at her, really looked at her, and then, in a voice so low it barely carried the distance between them, he had said, "Are you hurt?" It was such a small thing. 2 words, but coming from a man who had never once acknowledged her existence as anything more than furniture in his home, it cracked something open in her chest that she had no business allowing to crack. She had told him she was fine. He had told her to go home early that evening. He had sent one of his staff to her mother's apartment the following morning with an envelope of money. Not a fortune, but more than she earned in a month, with no note, no explanation, as though the act had embarrassed him somehow, as though he could not bear to be seen being kind. She should have known then. She should have recognized what that kind of man does to a woman. The way he pulls you in, not with warmth, but with the unbearable mystery of warmth withheld. She should have walked away. Instead, over the following weeks, small things happened. She began to find him in rooms she was working in, not approaching her, not speaking, but there, as though proximity were the only language available to him. Once, when she was reaching for something on a high shelf in the library, he had appeared beside her and taken it down himself without comment, without drama, and placed it in her hand, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Once, she had been reading in the garden during her lunch break, and he had come and sat, not beside her, but nearby, on a bench facing the opposite direction, and for 20 minutes they had both been silent in the same space, and she had felt, in that silence, a completeness she had no right to feel. Then one night, one reckless, irreversible night, the unthinkable happened. There had been a power outage. The estate had plunged into darkness. Most of the staff had gone home. There was wine left over from a dinner she had been serving. There was candlelight, and there was Damiano Caruso, for the first time in all the years she had known him, sitting across from her at a kitchen table like an ordinary man, asking her about her life. Actually, asking, not perfunctorily, not dismissively, but with the careful attention of someone who had been starved of genuine conversation for a very long time. She had told him about her mother, about university, about architecture, about the building she had always dreamed of designing, not a palace, not a monument, just a home. Her real home, a place where everyone who walked through the door felt like they mattered. He had listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he had said, with the quietest conviction she had ever heard from anyone, "You're going to build it." She had laughed softly, uncertainly. "I'm a maid," she had said, and he had looked at her across the candlelight with those dark, fathomless eyes. And he had said nothing at all, but the way he looked at her, it was the first time in her entire life that she had felt truly, completely, unbearably seen. What followed was exactly what you think it was, and Elena, sensible, careful, quietly brilliant. Elena knew even as it was happening that she was making the kind of mistake that cannot be unmade. But she had been invisible for so long, and he made her feel like the only thing in the room worth looking at. It lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of quiet gestures, of late evenings, of conversations that felt like confessions. 3 weeks of something she had no name for, because it never became anything with a name. Because Damiano Caruso was not a man who named things. He was not a man who made promises. He was not a man who let people stay. And then the woman arrived. Her name was Valentina Moreno. She swept into the Caruso estate on a Friday afternoon in March, like a storm system given a body, sleek and deliberate, dressed in white, with dark eyes that scanned every surface of a room and catalogued its value in an instant. She was the daughter of Rodrigo Moreno, the most powerful cartel boss in the Southern Territories, and she had come with her father's blessing, which, in their world, meant she had come with an army. She was elegant. She was dangerous. And she had her eyes fixed on Damiano Caruso like a woman who had never once failed to take what she set her sights on. Elena watched from the corridor as Damiano greeted Valentina in the entrance hall. She watched him take Valentina's hand. She watched Valentina lean close to his ear and say something that made his jaw tighten, but not unpleasantly. And she watched his lieutenant Marco lean across to another man and whisper with barely concealed satisfaction, "The boss has finally agreed. The alliance will be sealed within a month." Elena understood then. She understood everything. The 3 weeks had not been a beginning. They had been an accident, and she had the sick, certain knowledge of a woman who had always known the truth but had allowed herself, just once, to forget it. She went back to work. She said nothing. She kept her face neutral and her hands steady. But 2 weeks later, alone in the small bathroom of her mother's apartment, she stared at the unmistakable double line on a pregnancy test and realized that the story was not over. It was, in fact, just beginning. She told no one, not a single soul. She did not go to Damiano. She did not confront him. She did not make the kind of scene that would have been entirely justified and entirely dangerous. Because she was not naive, she knew what happened when women complicated the lives of men like Damiano Caruso. She had heard the whispers in that house. She had seen the way inconvenient things were quietly, efficiently removed. She went to work every day for the following week with a secret folded inside her like a wound. She was careful. She was professional. She was invisible. And then came that Tuesday morning, the verse, the broken glass, the cold sweep of his eyes. "Pack your things." 3 words, no face, no explanation. Later, she would learn from one of the other maids, whispered over coffee in the staff kitchen, voice low with the particular excitement of someone delivering damage, that Valentina had seen something, a glance perhaps, a look that lasted a fraction too long. And Valentina Moreno was not a woman who tolerated even the ghost of a threat to what she considered hers. She had said something to Damiano, and Damiano, who had never once allowed sentiment to interfere with strategy, had made the calculation and acted on it. He had dismissed Elena without a second thought, without even looking at her as he did it. She left without a word. She carried her box of belongings out through the servants' entrance. Not the front door, never the front door. That was not for people like her. And she walked 3 blocks to the bus stop in the cold March air, and she sat down on the metal bench and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and she breathed, just breathed. and then she opened her eyes and she looked at the city stretched out before her, grey and indifferent and full of possibilities that had not yet been discovered. And she made the decision that would take 3 years to fully unfold. She decided that she would not cry. She decided that she would not beg. She decided that she would not crumble. She decided that she would rise, slowly, methodically, with everything she had, and that when she returned to the world of Damiano Caruso, she would not return as a maid. She would return as someone he could not dismiss. The years that followed were not easy. They were not a montage of triumph set to uplifting music. They were grueling and lonely, and they required from Elena a discipline that most people never have to find, because most people are never pushed far enough to discover what they are truly made of. She returned to her mother's apartment, which now smelt of medicine and quiet suffering. Rosa's illness had progressed, but she was still there, still warm, still full of love, and when Elena told her she was pregnant, Rosa had not asked questions. She had simply opened her arms. And that embrace, in a small apartment above, a laundromat in a flickering neighborhood at the edge of the city, was the only softness Elena allowed herself for a very long time. She gave birth to a son in November. She named him Raphael, a name she had chosen because it meant healing, and because she needed something in her life that was oriented toward recovery. Raphael was born with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn silence, and from the first moment she held him, Elena understood something she had not expected, that love, real love, the unconditional kind, was the most clarifying force in the universe. She looked at her son, and all of the fear and grief and anger crystallized into something clean and hard and unbreakable. She would build him a life. She would build herself a life, and nothing, not poverty, not circumstance, not the ghost of a man who had never even looked at her, would stop her. She enrolled in a night architecture program at the city's technical college, attending classes after putting Raphael to sleep, studying at the kitchen table while her mother rested. She applied for every grant and scholarship she could find. She worked 2 jobs simultaneously, reception at a law firm during the day, waitressing 3 nights a week. She slept for hours on average. She did not complain. She moved through each day with the methodical focus of a woman who knows that every single step, no matter how small, is taking her somewhere. She was brilliant, and eventually, the world was forced to acknowledge it. At 27, she graduated top of her cohort. At 28, she was hired by one of the city's most prestigious architectural firms, Reyes and Associates, a name that meant nothing to her at the time beyond opportunity, beyond the first real door that had ever been opened to her by merit. Alone, she threw herself into the work with the kind of dedication that made her colleagues uncomfortable. She redesigned projects that had stalled. She found structural solutions that her senior colleagues had missed. She presented ideas with a quiet, unassailable confidence that was entirely new. Nothing like the girl who had polished marble floors and collected broken glass in her palms. It was at Reyes and Associates that she met Alejandro Reyes. He was 41. He was the founding partner of the firm, the sole heir to the Reyes business empire, a legitimate dynasty of real estate, construction, and technology that stretched across 4 cities. He was handsome, in a silver-templed, unhurried sort of way, a man who had known wealth all his life and wore it without ostentation. The way very secure people wear expensive things, simply, naturally, as though wealth were just another fabric. He was divorced, father to a teenage daughter who split her time between his penthouse and her mother's home in the south of France. He was kind, he was intelligent, he was, in every possible way, the opposite of Damiano Caruso. He noticed Elena on her 3rd day at the firm, not in the way Damiano had eventually noticed her, not after 2 years of invisibility, not as an afterthought. Alejandro noticed her immediately, the way that confident, perceptive people notice talent, with recognition, with interest, with the particular pleasure of a man who appreciates finding something extraordinary in an unexpected place. He asked her to lunch on a Wednesday. She said no. He asked again on a Friday. She said no again. He smiled both times with the easy patience of a man who was accustomed to working for things he wanted, and she respected that more than she cared to admit. Over the following months, he earned her trust in increments, with honesty, with consistency, with the remarkably refreshing habit of actually doing what he said he would do. He met Raphael and did not flinch, did not recalibrate his interest, did not become suddenly careful in the way men do when they encounter a complication they hadn't bargained for. He bought Raphael a set of building blocks and sat on the apartment floor with him for an hour while Elena stood in the doorway watching and feeling something she had been afraid to feel for a very long time. She married Alejandro Reyes one year, later in a small ceremony with 12 guests. Her mother, healthier now, better doctors, better medicine. Things that were possible now that Elena's life had fundamentally changed, cried through the entire ceremony. Raphael sat in the front row in a tiny suit and looked solemn and important. Alejandro placed a ring on Elena's finger and looked at her with the steady, uncomplicated love of a man who understood exactly what he was receiving and considered himself fortunate. Elena looked beautiful that day, not in the way she had looked beautiful in the Caruso estate, quietly, invisibly, the way a woman looks beautiful when no one is watching. She looked beautiful the way a woman looks when she has rebuilt herself from the wreckage of someone else's carelessness. Her hair was swept up, her dress was ivory, her posture was perfect. Her eyes were clear. She had been invited, through Alejandro's business connections, to dozens of high-profile events since their marriage. Gallery openings, charity galas, business dinners at restaurants where the menus had no prices. She had navigated all of it with an ease that surprised even her, because somewhere between the night shift waitressing and the architecture degree and the years of silent, disciplined survival, Elena Vasquez had transformed into Elena Reyes. And Elena Reyes was not a woman anyone dismissed. Asterisk, she had new hair, a different style that fell in dark waves around a face that confidence had reached. She dressed now in silks and sharp cuts, in colors that she chose deliberately. She wore heels that added 4 inches to her height and a particular tilt to her chin that she had not had before, not arrogance, but the natural bearing of a woman who had earned every inch of the ground she stood on. Her voice, which had once been the smallest thing in whatever room she occupied, was now the voice people leaned in to hear. Not because she spoke loudly, but because she spoke with the weight of someone who had survived things that most people in those gilded rooms could not imagine. No one who met Elena Reyes at a charity gala would have ever placed her in a servant's uniform, and no one would have found the thread that connected her to the girl who had pressed shirts and polished floors and carried broken glass in her bare hands. This was not an accident. This was a choice. Elena had not hidden her past out of shame. She had simply outgrown it so thoroughly, so completely, that it no longer fit the woman she had become. The transformation was real, it was earned, it was total. And so when the invitation arrived, thick cream paper, embossed lettering, for the annual Caruso Foundation Charity Gala, the most significant social event in the city's elite calendar, and when Alejandro placed it on the kitchen table and said, casually, over his morning coffee, Caruso's been trying to get my firm involved in his new development project. I think it's time we attended. Elena looked at the invitation for a long, still moment, and she felt absolutely nothing. Which was, she realized, the most dangerous feeling of all. Fine, she said. I'll find something to wear. The Caruso Foundation Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Hotel Imperiale, the most beautiful building in the city. All gold leaf and marble columns and chandeliers that dripped light like warm rain. The room was filled with the city's most powerful, most dangerous, most beautifully dressed people. Politicians whose hands shook when they received Caruso's calls. Business titans who built their empires on his cooperation. Women who wore their jewels like armor. Men who wore their smiles like weapons. Elena walked into that room on Alejandro's arm, and she was, without question, the most striking woman there. She wore midnight blue, a gown that moved like water, cut simply but perfectly, that made every other dress in the room look like it was trying too hard. Her hair was down. She almost never wore it down at formal events, but tonight she had decided, and she trusted her instincts now in a way she never had before. She wore a single diamond at her throat, Alejandro's gift on their first anniversary, and nothing else. She needed nothing else. People turned when she walked in, not all of them, but enough. She accepted a glass of champagne. She smiled at Alejandro's business associates. She spoke to the wife of a city councilman about a waterfront development project. And she said 3 things in the space of 90 seconds that made the woman look at her with sharpened attention and pull out a card. She was calm, she was present, she was exactly where she had decided 3 years ago on a cold metal bus stop bench that she would one day be. And then Damiano Caruso entered the room. She sensed him before she saw him. Some primitive, infuriating part of her recognized the shift in the room's atmosphere, the way conversations softened, the way backs straightened, the way even the most powerful men in the room rearranged themselves subtly in relation to the space he occupied. She had forgotten, somehow, in all the years of building herself up, that he was still a physical force. Still, that particular combination of stillness and contained danger that she had once found devastating. He was older. Not much the years sat well on men like him, which was one of the universe's more irritating injustices. There were faint lines at the corners of his eyes. His jaw was the same. His bearing was the same. He wore black, as always. And beside him was Valentina, still beautiful, still possessive in the way she stood, her hand resting on his arm with territorial certainty. They had married, Elena knew. Of course they had. The alliance had been sealed, the empire consolidated. Valentina had gotten everything she had positioned herself to receive. Elena watched Damiano move through the room from across a distance of perhaps 40 feet, and she felt the strangest thing. Not pain, she had processed the pain years ago, in the small hours of the night. Sitting at a kitchen table with architecture textbooks and a sleeping baby in the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose, not anger, she had metabolized the anger into fuel, into every late night. Every exam, every presentation, every step upward. What she felt now, watching him, was something far more complex and far more interesting. She felt curious. She wanted to know if he would recognize her. She wanted to see the precise moment if it came when recognition crossed his face. She wanted to know what he had made of himself in the years since he had dismissed her with 3 words and turned back to his phone. She realized, with a calm that slightly astonished her, absolutely nothing from him. No apology, no acknowledgement, no settling of accounts. She wanted only to stand in the same room as him and feel the difference between who she had been and who she was. Now it was Alejandro who made the introduction happen. He had spotted Caruso across the room and had said, pleasantly, "There's the man himself. Come on, I should say hello," and had guided Elena through the crowd before she had the chance to redirect him. And then they were there, 3 feet away, and Damiano Caruso turned at Alejandro's voice, and his eyes moved from Elena to Elena and nothing. Not the faintest flicker of recognition. He looked at her the way he would look at any beautiful, elegant woman at a charity gala, with polite, brief appreciation, with the practiced courtliness of a man who has attended 1,000 such events and perfected the performance of social grace over the void of genuine interest. He took her hand when Alejandro introduced her, pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles, in the old-world manner of his family, and said, "Mrs. Reyes, it's a pleasure." And Elena Reyes looked directly into the eyes of the man who had dismissed her, who had sent her out through a servant's entrance with a cardboard box and 3 words, who had never once looked at her enough to remember her face, and she smiled, graciously, warmly, without a trace of anything behind it. "The pleasure is mine," she said. His wife, Valentina, appeared at his side moments later and regarded Elena with a swift, calibrated assessment of a woman who evaluates all other women as competition. She, too, showed no recognition. Why would she? She had only ever seen Elena from a corridor, from a distance, through the lens of jealousy directed not at a person but at an inconvenience. She had forgotten what she won against. They spoke for perhaps 12 minutes, Alejandro and Damiano, about the development project, about construction timelines, about a potential partnership that would reshape an entire district of the city. Elena contributed precisely 3 times, each contribution technically sharp, each one landing with quiet authority. And she watched Damiano listen to her. She watched him register her intelligence, her knowledge, her ease in that room, watched him recalibrate, slightly, the category into which he had placed her. She watched him begin to find her interesting in the abstract way powerful men find capable women interesting, when they have no prior context to corrupt the perception. Asterisk. He had no idea. None. He was looking at the woman he had made and feeling the first faint stirrings of a fascination he could not yet name, and he had no idea that he was the one who had made her. The cruelty of it, Elena thought privately as she sipped her champagne and smiled at something Valentina was saying. The devastating, almost poetic cruelty of it was that Damiano Caruso was now interested in a woman who had already moved so completely beyond him that his interest was almost beside the point. The business partnership between Reyes and Associates and the Caruso Foundation was announced 6 weeks later. It was the largest urban development project the city had seen in a decade, the transformation of an entire waterfront district into a mixed-use residential and cultural complex. Elena was assigned as lead architect, Alejandro's choice. Her credentials justified it. Her vision for the project was what had ultimately convinced Caruso's team to move forward, which meant that Elena now attended regular project meetings at the Caruso headquarters. She dressed for those meetings with the deliberateness of a general preparing for battle, not in a way anyone could see, not with any visible armor, but internally, structurally. She prepared herself to occupy the same professional space as Damiano Caruso, without allowing the past to leak through into the present. She was professional, she was focused, she was exceptional at her job. These were the only things that mattered. He noticed her at the second meeting, not with recognition that never came, and this fascinated her in a way she examined carefully, turning it over in quiet moments, trying to understand it. He noticed her the way he had begun to notice her at the gala, with the growing attentiveness of a man who keeps finding that someone surprises him. She made a presentation about the cultural integration plan for the waterfront complex, and she watched him watching her, and she felt him shift from professional assessment to something more personal, more confused, more interested than he had perhaps intended. It was his lieutenant, a man named Costa, who said it first, loudly and discreetly. In the corridor after the meeting, when he didn't know Elena was still in the building, "The Reyes woman is extraordinary," Costa said. "Not just the work. There's something about her I can't place, like I've seen her somewhere before." Damiano's response was inaudible, but Elena, pausing just inside the boardroom door, felt the comments settle into her chest like a stone into still water. Costa couldn't place her. Damiano, she was quite certain, had no such instinct. He had never looked at her enough to carry even the ghost of her face, but something was changing. She could feel it in the way his attention moved in meetings, how it returned to her. Specifically the way attention does when it has been caught by something it cannot fully explain. She felt it in the way he had begun to find reasons to be present at project walkthroughs, which had previously been handled entirely by his development team. She felt it in the way he spoke to her now, not as an employee, not as a contractor, but as someone he was slowly recognizing as a peer. It was ironic, she thought. He respected her now, in this boardroom, in this context. He had no idea that she had been kneeling on his floors less than 4 years ago. The first time he said anything personal was on a Thursday afternoon. During a site walkthrough at the waterfront, his development team had gone on ahead. He had fallen back, ostensibly to take a call, and Elena had stayed near the water's edge reviewing her site plans. When the call ended, he had walked up beside her and stood there for a moment looking out at the water, grey and restless under an overcast sky, and he had said, without preamble, "You designed that community housing complex on the east side, the one near the laundromat district." She had gone still. "I recognize the design language," he continued. "The spaces feel like they were built for people who needed to feel safe. Not the way architects usually design for low-income housing. There's something in it that's personal." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the water, not at her. His profile was exactly as she remembered it, and she hated, slightly, that it still had the same gravity. "It was personal," she said. "I grew up near there." He turned then, and he looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had looked at her that night in the candlelight in his kitchen. 3 years ago and a lifetime away, with the particular attention of someone encountering a truth they hadn't expected. "You didn't grow up with money," he said. It was not a question. Not an accusation. Just a recognition. "No," she said simply. Something shifted in his face. Something she recognized from that other time, from that other version of themselves. And she felt the old danger of it, the pull of that particular expression on that particular face. And she turned deliberately back to her site plans. "We should catch up to the team," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, of course, Valentina Moreno Caruso was not a woman who missed things. She had spent a lifetime in rooms where power was negotiated and alliances were formed and betrayals were planned behind beautiful smiles. And she had developed, through years of training, in that world, a particular radar for threats. She noticed the way Damiano's attention moved in meetings. She noticed how he talked about the development project with an enthusiasm that, in the 5 years of their marriage, she had rarely heard. You might play to anything. She noticed that the lead architect was beautiful and capable, and the kind of woman who seemed to require nothing from anyone, which Valentina knew, from experience, was the most dangerous kind. She began making inquiries, discreet ones, the kind that cost favors and came back with thorough answers. She learned that Elena Vasquez had grown up in the East Side, had worked various service jobs before going back to school, had married Alejandro Reyes 2 years prior, had a son, aged 3, of no registered paternity. She had her people pull employment records because Valentina Moreno Caruso had access to the kind of people who could pull employment records, and she found it. Elena Vasquez. Caruso household staff, dates of employment, dates of dismissal, held this information for 3 days before she decided what to do with it. And what she decided was characteristically ruthless. She would say nothing to Damiano, not yet. She would wait. She would watch. And she would use it when it was most useful, not to protect her marriage, but to protect her position. These were not, in Valentina's world, the same thing. But there was one thing she had not yet discovered, one thing buried beneath the careful architecture of Elena's rebuilt life, and it would be the thing that changed everything. The discovery came not from Valentina, but from the most unexpected direction possible. Rafael was 3 years and 4 months old when Elena brought him to the Reyes architectural firm one afternoon when his childminder cancelled without warning. It was a busy day, and Alejandro was in meetings, and Elena had a deadline that could not be moved, so she brought him in, set him up with his building blocks in the corner of her office, and worked. She had not accounted for children's particular talent for wandering. Rafael had slipped out of her office in the 20 minutes she had been on a conference call, and had made his way, as children somehow always do, precisely where they should not go. He had wandered into the boardroom at the end of the hall, where, by absolute chance, a meeting was wrapping up between Alejandro's senior partners and a late arriving guest, Damiano Caruso, who had stopped by to review revised project plans. Elena heard it from her office, the commotion, the sudden laughter of men, the higher, more serious sound of a child's voice, and she went cold. She was out of her chair and down the hallway before she had finished her thought. She stood in the doorway of the boardroom. Damiano Caruso was crouched down on one knee, at eye level with Rafael, who was looking at him with the grave, assessing expression that was so characteristically his own, that particular look of serious consideration that Elena had always found at once adorable and heartbreaking. The other men in the room were smiling at the scene. Alejandro's partner was saying something about children and workplace interruptions, and Damiano was looking at the boy with an expression that Elena had never seen on his face before. Something unguarded, something quiet, something almost gentle. "What's your name?" Damiano asked. "Rafael," the boy said. "How old are you?" Rafael, the boy, held up 3 fingers with great seriousness, then reconsidered and added a 4th. Partially, Damiano almost smiled. Elena watched it happen, watched. The corner of that hard mouth softened, just barely, just for a fraction of a second. And then he looked up, perhaps sensing her in the doorway, and their eyes met. And she watched him look from her to the boy, and back to her, and something crossed his face that she couldn't fully read. Not recognition, not yet. Nothing so clear as that, but something. Some seismic, subterranean stirring of something he didn't yet have words for. "I'm sorry," Elena said, stepping into the room, her voice professionally steady. Her hands the only things that wanted to betray her. She pressed them flat against her sides. He wandered off. "I apologize for the interruption." She crossed the room and took Rafael's hand, and as she did, she was aware with every nerve in her body of Damiano still on one knee. Watching her, she did not look at him. She picked up her son and turned to leave. "He has your eyes," Damiano said. She stopped. The room was quiet. The other men were distracted, looking at phones, resuming their conversation. Only Damiano and Elena occupied this particular moment. She turned. She looked at him. He had risen from the floor and was standing now, and there was something in his face that she had seen once before, that expression from his study, in the dark. The night he told her his father had died in that chair. Lost, unmoored, as though something he had believed to be solid had become suddenly uncertain beneath his feet. "He has his father's eyes," she said quietly. And she walked out. She told Alejandro that night. Not everything. Not the pregnancy. Not the dismissal. Not the 3 weeks of candlelight and Neruda poetry and a man who had made her feel visible. For the first and last time before turning her out through the servants' entrance. She told him enough. She told him who Rafael's father was. She had always told him there was a father, and that the situation was complicated, and that she would tell him when the time was right. And Alejandro, remarkable, patient, unhurried Alejandro had always said, simply, "When you're ready." She told him now because she felt, for the first time, that the situation had developed a gravity of its own, and that things were beginning to move toward a collision. She could no longer fully steer around. Alejandro was quiet for a long time. After she finished speaking, he was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. Outside, Raphael was asleep. The apartment was very still. Does he know? Alejandro asked. No, Elena said. He suspects. She thought about the look on Damiano's face in that boardroom, the way he had looked from the boy to her. He might be starting to, she said. Alejandro was quiet again. Then he said something that broke her in a way she had not expected to be broken by anything anymore. He said, whatever happens, Raphael is mine. That is not negotiable. And you are my wife. And that is not negotiable either. He looked up at her across the table. I'm not asking you to fight this alone anymore. She had cried then. Properly. For the first time in a very long time. With the specific grief of a woman who has held herself together so completely for so long that being offered genuine support is indistinguishable from being undone. It was Costa who finally told Damiano, not out of malice. Costa was the kind of lieutenant who delivered information because he believed his boss deserved to have it, regardless of what the boss would do with it. He came to Damiano's study on a Tuesday evening and placed a folder on the desk and said, without drama, I've been trying to figure out why Elena Reyes looked familiar. I found out why. You're going to want to read this. Damiano read it slowly. He was the kind of man who read everything at exactly the same pace. Regardless of what it contained, it was a discipline he had cultivated, a refusal to let urgency control him. But when he reached the employment records, the dates, the name, the household position, he went very still in the way that Damiano Caruso went still when something had struck him somewhere he did not expect to be struck. He sat with the folder closed in front of him for a long time after Costa had left the room. He sat so long that the light outside his window changed from evening gold to night black. He sat with the specific stillness of a man reconstructing something, a face, a memory, a version of events that he had never bothered to look at closely enough and gradually. With the terrible precision of a man whose mind was trained to see connections, he began to see it. The way she moved, something familiar in the quietness of it, the precision, the community housing project near the laundromat district. The things she had said about growing up without money. The boy's eyes, still, with that particular quality of looking at the world as though cataloging it quietly from a safe distance. He stood up abruptly. He walked to the window. He pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and he stared at his own reflection in it, and he understood, with a clarity that was equal parts revelation and damnation, that he had dismissed a woman who was carrying his child. He had turned her out without a look, without an explanation, without a conversation, because Valentina had told him to, because an alliance had required it, because he had been, in that moment, exactly the version of himself that he most despised, the version that calculated instead of felt, that protected the empire instead of the person, that chose strategy over the only thing in that house that had ever made him feel like a human being rather than a machine. He had been to that community housing complex once, 2 years ago, for a city planning consultation that his development team had attended. He had walked through it and thought he remembered this now, the memory surfacing with horrible, precise clarity that it was the most genuinely human design he had ever seen in a public housing project. That whoever had built it had understood something about people that most architects didn't bother to understand. He had said so to his development director. He had said, find out who designed this. His development director had apparently never followed through. He thought about Raphael, 3 years and some months old, dark eyes, his father's eyes. Elena had said so herself, not as a taunt, not as a confession, just as a quiet, measured statement of truth. And he had stood there in a boardroom and watched her carry his son out of the room. And he had said nothing, because he had not yet known what he was seeing. He pressed his hand harder against the cold glass. He thought about what she had built. He thought about what she had survived. He thought about who she had become entirely through her own work, her own discipline, her own refusal to be destroyed by what he had carelessly done to her. And he felt something he had not felt in a very long time, possibly ever, the specific weight of a shame that cannot be reasoned with or deflected, the kind that simply has to be carried. He came to the site the following afternoon. Elena was there alone. Her team had left for the day, and she had stayed to take measurements at the northern boundary of the waterfront. She heard his car first, then his footsteps on the gravel. She did not turn around. Elena, he said. He had never called her by her first name before, not in any version of their acquaintance. She turned, she looked at him, her face was composed, her posture steady, her her expression neutral in that particular way. She had mastered not cold, not closed, just professionally and entirely present. "Mr. Caruso," she said. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at her, and this time, she could see that he was looking at her correctly. Fully, with the eyes of a man who finally understood what he was seeing. The recognition was complete now, and she watched it sit on him like, "Wait, I know who you are," he said. "I know," she said. "I know about Raphael." "I know that too," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the waterfront moved, gulls overhead, the distant sound of water, the indifferent rhythm of the city at dusk. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment before answering, and she chose her words with the same precision she brought to everything. "Because I didn't need anything from you," she said. "I needed it once, when I was kneeling on your floor, picking up broken glass, and you told me to pack my things and turn back to your phone. I would have told you then, if you had given me a single reason to believe it would matter." She paused. He didn't flinch. She gave him that. He absorbed it without deflection. "I didn't know," he said. "About the pregnancy." She said, "No, but you didn't know because you didn't look. And you didn't look because I was never a person to you." She said this without bitterness, just with the flat, unadorned clarity of a true thing. "I was staff. I was convenient, and then I was an inconvenience, and then I was gone. That is all you knew about me." "That's not true," he said. And something in his voice had changed, something had cracked through the surface of that controlled, impenetrable voice. "It is not true that you were nothing to me." She looked at him. She said nothing. "What I felt, what happened between us, it wasn't nothing," he said. "I don't." He stopped. He pressed a hand to his jaw. He looked like a man trying to dismantle a wall he had spent 30 years building, with his bare hands, in front of someone who deserved a better tool. "I don't have the language for this. I have never had the language for this. But it was not nothing. Asterisk, I know," she said, and her voice, for the first time, was not neutral. It was very quiet, and very sad, and very old. The sadness of someone who has spent a long time past the point of needing the thing they needed to hear, and who now receives it exactly too late. "I know it wasn't nothing. That's what made it so terrible." He looked at her across the evening light, and she could see it, the full weight of what he had done, settling into him like water into stone. "Slow and permanent ruffle," he said, and his voice broke just slightly on the single word. He has a father," Elena said, and her voice was gentle but absolute, like a door closing on the last inch of air. "He has Alejandro, has a man who sat on the floor of a small apartment and built things with him before he could even walk. He has a man who chose him freely, without obligation, and who loves him with a kind of love that doesn't cost him anything to give." She looked at Damiano directly. "I will not take that from my son. Not for any reason. Not for you." The silence between them was enormous and full and entirely final. "Then what do you want from me?" he asked. It was not a challenge. It was the genuine question of a man who had arrived at the end of his calculation and found himself without a move. She thought about it. She thought about it genuinely, honestly, standing at the edge of a waterfront that she had been hired to help rebuild. Looking at the man who had once made her invisible and was now looking at her with the full, unguarded attention she had once. Spent years hoping for. She thought about the girl on the metal bench in the cold March air. She thought about Rosa opening her arms in the small apartment above the laundromat. She thought about Raphael in his tiny suit at her wedding, solemn and important. She thought about Alejandro's hands wrapped around a cold coffee mug saying, "Whatever happens, you are not alone." "I want," she said, "for you to allow this project to be what it should be. A real community, a place where people feel safe. I want your foundation to fund the community center at full capacity, not the reduced version your finance team proposed." She looked at him steadily. "And I want you to leave my family alone." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's everything," she said. He agreed to the community center funding the following week. The announcement was made by his foundation director, full capacity, no reductions, with an endowment that would sustain it for 20 years. Elena's design was unchanged, uncompromised, exactly as she had envisioned it. The project was completed 14 months later. It became, within its first year of opening, the most celebrated urban development project the city had seen in a generation. The waterfront district was transformed, not into the gleaming, soulless luxury complex that Damiano's finance team had originally proposed, but into something that felt like what Elena had always dreamed of. A place where people of every background could coexist, contribute, and matter. The community center stood at its heart, all glass and warm wood and light, with spaces for children and elderly residents and artists and families, with a design language that said, without word, that everyone who walked through those doors was worth designing for. The opening ceremony was attended by the city's most prominent figures. Elena stood at the podium and spoke clearly, warmly, without notes, about what the project had meant to her, about growing up in the East Side, about her mother, about the laundromat and the flickering streetlights and the particular quality of hope that survives in places where people have very little. She did not mention Damiano Caruso by name, though he was in the audience. She thanked her husband, she thanked her team, she thanked her son, who was in the fourth row in a new suit, a little larger now. Still solemn, still important, Damiano Caruso sat in the back of that audience, and he watched the woman he had made, who had failed, who had built herself from nothing into this. And he felt the full, complete, devastating accounting of what choices look like when they've had years to compound. He felt it not with self-pity, but with the specific clarity of a man who has finally, too late, learned to see. He did not approach Elena after the ceremony. He did not send a message. He left the way he had come, quietly, efficiently, without fanfare, and he did not look back. He had been given his accounting. He had made his contribution. The rest was no longer his. There is one thing left to tell. 3 months after the waterfront project opened, Elena received a letter. It was handwritten on simple paper, not embossed stationery, not official letterhead, and the handwriting was controlled and careful in the way of someone who does not write by hand often but has made an effort. It said only this: I looked at the community center plans for a long time last night, particularly the entrance foyer, the way the space opens up, the way the light comes in from the north-facing windows. I think I understand what you were building. Not the building. What you were building. You were right. Everyone who walks through that door feels like they matter. I don't deserve credit for making you who you are. You made yourself. But I want you to know I see it. I finally see it. I'm sorry I couldn't see it sooner. There was no signature. But she knew. She read it once, then she folded it along its original creases and she placed it in the back of her desk drawer, not to revisit it often, not to dwell in it, but because it was a true thing. And true things deserve to be kept. And then she closed the drawer, and she walked out of her office. And she went down to the parking garage where Alejandro was waiting with Rafael asleep in the backseat, soft and small and perfect under a blanket with his dark eyes closed. She got into the car. Alejandro looked at her. Good day, he said. She looked at her son sleeping. She looked at her husband's face, familiar and kind and entirely reliably present. She looked at the years behind her, the cold bus stop, the broken glass, the servant's entrance, the night school, the night shifts, the small apartment above the laundromat, the scholarship, the degree, the firm, the gala, the waterfront, the podium, the letter in the drawer. She looked at all of it and she felt it. The clean, complete, hard-won fullness of a life that was entirely, irreversibly her own. Perfect, she said. And Alejandro smiled and started the car. And they drove home through the city, past the waterfront, now lit against the dark water, past the community center with its north-facing windows, past the laundromat district with its flickering streetlights, past all the small and large places where Elena Vasquez had been invisible and afraid and alone. And Elena Reyes was none of those things anymore. At last, exactly who she had decided to be. Some women are dismissed. Some women survived the dismissal, and a rare few, the ones with fire in the quiet places, the ones who carry their grief and their grace in equal measure, those women return, not for revenge, not for recognition, not to be seen by the people who refused to see them. Return because they promised themselves they would. Because somewhere between the broken glass and the bus stop and the long, dark years of becoming, they decided that the end of the story would be written in their own handwriting.